Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second part of my conversation with the historian Robert Saunders, marking the 100th anniversary of the birth of Margaret Thatcher. And today, we are very much focused on the legacy of her life and her career, but also the ideas that she inspired. What do we mean when we talk about Thatcherism? How distinctive is Thatcherism relative to other political philosophies? And what is its purchase for the politics of today? Robert, we're going to talk about the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, the meaning of Thatcherism today, what she means inside and outside Conservative Party, United Kingdom. But I just want to start with where we left off last time, and in particular, this question about some of the myths that have built up around the story of her career and her prime ministership. You talked about the great damage that had been done to the Conservative Party by this belief that her strength was her inflexible, uncompromising, ideological stance on political questions about which she was actually far more pragmatic and willing to compromise. So there was certainly damage done to the Conservative Party by the belief that what they had in Margaret Thatcher was a leader who wouldn't budge. But the other myth that built up around Margaret Thatcher does relate to the circumstances of her fall. And again, this may be true of any long-serving prime minister or political leader, Bismarck in Germany. One can think of all sorts of where all careers have to come to an end. And in a way, everyone should probably be willing to just accept that that's the case. But the circumstances in which they do end always look like betrayal on a vast scale. In Thatcher's case, the undefeated prime minister, never defeated at the ballot box, brought down by the weakness, the cowardice of the men around her. And by that point, we should make clear it was just men around her. Photograph of her final cabinet, she's sitting in the middle, 20, 22, 24 white men, all of whom look as though they're aged between about 52 and 65. It's an amazing photograph, actually. And there she is in the middle of them all. And it was those men who brought her down. Is there any truth to the myth? I mean, was she the victim of a conspiracy of weak and wet Tory men who didn't have the stomach for the fight? Last time you suggested that many of them had seen the beginning of the end well before the end came most clearly into view. How do you read the circumstances of her downfall?
Well, that would certainly be her view. She famously says, "It was treachery with a smile on its face." One of the ways in which Margaret Thatcher was in many ways a brilliant actor who knows how to deliver a great line. I think there's no question the circumstances of her fall trigger a kind of collective nervous breakdown in the Conservative Party, because this was the first time since 1922 that the Conservative Party had removed one of its own leaders in office in peacetime. And it happens with extraordinary speed. So Michael Heseltine challenges her for the leadership on, I think, the 14th of November. She resigns on the 22nd of November. There's a new prime minister in place by the 28th. So this entire explosion happens in 2 weeks. Now, her party does that because it believes that she is going to lose the next general election. But the fact that she never does lose the next general election, that thesis is never put to the test, means that it is always possible thereafter to imagine a fantasy Thatcher who will be carrying all before her, who's undefeated, who never compromises, who never loses. And to say that the Conservatives' problems in the 1990s are not a kind of consequence of the end of her career, they are what happens because this extraordinary figure is removed. And I think the Conservative Party never really recovers from that, and to some extent those neuroses are still there today.
The man who succeeded her, John Major, there was a lot of jockeying to succeed her, as there always is with every prime minister. So Keir Starmer's only been in office for what feels like about 20 minutes, but already the briefing and the counter-briefing has started. Who's going to be the stalking horse? Who's going to bring him down? And so on. It's an occupational hazard of holding that office, but many came and went, some of them now rather obscure figures. There was a point in time where John Moore, the health secretary, had been anointed her chosen successor. I don't think many people, if any, have heard of him today. Cecil Parkinson, for a while, he rose and fell. There were others. John Major he came, relatively speaking, from nowhere. So I read and indeed wrote about the 3 volumes of Charles Moore's biography of Margaret Thatcher. And in my review of the second volume, which ends in 1987, I say one of the remarkable features of this volume, a long book, exhaustive, is that John Major doesn't feature in it anywhere. So in the second of the 3 volumes, the man who's going to succeed her isn't even on the scene yet. And he did succeed her in part because he was thought to be very rapidly, suddenly, not over time, her chosen successor, the best of a bad lot, and the one that she thought had the best chance of carrying on her legacy, but also possibly being subject to her advice. So he was a cipher in a way for her. And as you say, it's a bit like ducking witches. If they sink, they're innocent. If they rise to the surface, they're guilty. And so you have to sink them anyway. If the Conservatives had gone on and lost the 1992 election, people would have said, well, how ridiculous to remove her because you lost it anyway. Because they went on and won the 1992 election, people were able to say, well, look, we were going to win that election anyway. And all sorts of other myths circulate around Thatcher's fall, including the line that people often cite. So they'd be citing it in relation to Keir Starmer now. He who wields the knife never wears the crown. This is thought to be one of these iron laws of British politics. Michael Heseltine wielded the knife, but the person who does that is punished for that act in a kind of medieval sense, and the successor will be someone else. Well, there are many counterexamples, one of which is Margaret Thatcher. She wielded the knife against Ted Heath, and she wore the crown. There is something extraordinary about the totemic significance of this event, which in many ways, it's how politics works. She had reached the end of the road. She probably would have lost the next election. I think John Major won it. He turned out to be a good choice if what you want to do is win the 1992 election. Does it still resonate in British politics today, do you think? So as people are talking about replacing Keir Starmer, I'm sure one of the things they're thinking of, though it's at the beginning, not the end of a potentially long premiership, they're thinking of the fall of Margaret Thatcher. Why is it the one that just grabs people's attention? Tony Blair was brought down by the man who wielded the knife, Gordon Brown. There's something about this. Is it the drama, the Shakespearean drama of it? Those of us who are of the right age can remember her in Paris coming out, saying that she will fight on, bashing away John Sargent's microphone, looking slightly wild-eyed, but also like hunted prey. Is it just the drama of it?
I think that's certainly part of it. It is a great televisual moment. And of course, it is the first fall of a leader to play out live on television. You get these extraordinary moments of Geoffrey Howe rising in the House of Commons to deliver his destructive resignation speech. Now, that would not have been televised 5 years earlier. That in itself is a new development. As you say, the footage of Margaret Thatcher coming out of the embassy in Paris, sweeping aside reporters and declaring, I fight on, I fight to win. This is magnificent television, and it's seared on the memory of that generation in a way that the fall of Harold Wilson, for example, is just not. And I think, in terms of what you were saying about John Major, leaders who are in power for a long time always struggle with the succession because, in a sense, a part of their success is that they outlast all of their rivals and that they're not keen to create alternative centres of power. So John Major is, in some respects, Margaret Thatcher's anointed candidate, and that's a paradox of this election, that the person who wins it is the person that Margaret Thatcher has given her blessing to. But she always rather regretted that later in life. Douglas Hurd tells a story that he was at dinner with her once in the mid-90s, I think, and she was sounding off about John Major and what a disaster he was and what a betrayal he was and how he had junked her legacy. And so he said to her, Margaret, why did you support him for the leadership then? Because, of course, Douglas Hurd had also run in 1990. And she said, oh, Douglas, it was a terribly weak field, which he didn't find very encouraging. But actually, in lots of ways, John Major looks like the right answer to the question in 1990, because you have a prime minister who appears to have lost her ability to compromise. And that's very evident in policies like the poll tax. And you now have a prime minister who is much more flexible, much more consensual, and who will get rid of the poll tax. So if it's a policy problem, you've fixed that. You've had a prime minister who could no longer get on with her senior colleagues and had gone to war with the people who had been her closest allies throughout the 1980s. You now have a prime minister who has very good people skills and is actually very good at working with people from a variety of different political traditions. And one of the comments that's made by Margaret Thatcher's supporters in 1989 in that document we talked about in the previous episode is she's great for the 80s, but she's not for the 1990s. That this is a Cold War politician who doesn't suit a new, more consensual, more peaceful world. And again, John Major looks like a politician for a different kind of political world. He famously said he wants a country at ease with itself. And that's a very different story to the kind of thing that Margaret Thatcher would say about her politics. So it looks in 1990 like he is the right answer. The problem he has is that he's constantly then held against a standard, a set of purity tests about being a Thatcherite that Margaret Thatcher herself would never have passed, because she is allowed to compromise and he is not.
One of the things that she believed during her time in office, and she believed it when the SDP briefly looked like they were going to be the opposition to her government and they would be the possible alternative government, is that that was probably an illusion, because British politics is always, in a way, a fight against socialism. The Conservative Party, certainly for the previous 80 years and for the foreseeable future, British politics would be divided by the forces of conservatism, whose job was to take on and defeat the forces of socialism. And as the SDP faded away, and as in 1987, it was Neil Kinnock that she was up against, and as in 1992, it would be Neil Kinnock that the Conservative Party would be up against, it seemed to confirm that view that in the end, for all the sort of spinning of the plates and the things that might happen in the short term, British politics in its basic configuration will come down to a choice between conservatism and some or other version of socialism. By 1997, the Labour Party was being led by a man who had started his life as a conservative in a way, Tony Blair, and had basically ditched socialism as the ideology of the party. Margaret Thatcher was alive and she lived through the New Labour years. She lived long enough to be invited by Gordon Brown to Downing Street when he replaced Tony Blair as a kind of revered elder statesman. Did the New Labour experience suggest that actually that was the other thing that had changed? So her battle line, which is it's conservatism, and you line up the enemy and you make it clear that what they're offering is socialism. By 97, it was not possible to do that. John Major tried, failed hopelessly. Tony Blair won comfortably, partly because that strategy didn't work anymore. Do we know what Margaret Thatcher thought of that? Do we know what Margaret Thatcher thought of Tony Blair? But is Tony Blair and New Labour, is that the point where the battle lines of the 1980s have decisively shifted onto a new ground that many people claimed was Thatcher's ultimate victory?
It's often claimed that Margaret Thatcher said that her greatest achievement in politics was New Labour. Now, actually, the evidence that she ever said that is fairly scant. She might have said it, but if she did say it, it's very much at odds with almost everything else that she said about New Labour during its time in power. That she talked about it as embarrassed by our history, ashamed of our traditions. She talked about it as a boneless wonder. She was very hostile to things that it did in terms of welfare spending, its pro-Europeanism. And I think we should actually be really sceptical of the idea that New Labour represents a continuation of Thatcherism. So on one level, of course, there are aspects of the 1980s settlement that endure, partly, as you say, because of the end of the Cold War, which shrinks the space for imagining different economic systems and alternatives to capitalism. So it's true that Britain broadly accepts a settlement that's based around free market, globalised capital, as happens in many other countries at the same time. But if we look at other areas of policy, Margaret Thatcher was a prime minister who legislated to declare homosexuality a pretended family relationship and to ban the promotion of homosexuality in state schools. The New Labour government is the first explicitly gay-friendly government that has gay cabinet ministers, that legislates for things like civil partnerships. And then, of course, we get a Conservative government that legislates on gay marriage. Margaret Thatcher was very hostile to devolution. The New Labour era creates an entirely new constitutional settlement in which we have parliaments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Margaret Thatcher abolished the Greater London Council and most of the metropolitan councils. Over the New Labour era and indeed the Cameron era and beyond, we then get the reanimation of the Greater London Council, an elected London mayor and the extension of mayors across the country. New Labour is a very welfarist government. It absolutely is committed to public services. It boasts about how much money it's spending on public services. If we fast forward a bit, by the time we get to COVID, we have a Conservative government paying the wages of everyone in the country during a lockdown. We have a Conservative government under Liz Truss that is subsidising people's energy bills. These are all things that Margaret Thatcher would find deeply dislocating. So the idea that we live in Margaret Thatcher's world is, I think, one that we should be deeply cautious about.
And yet what's so interesting about that story as you tell it is that the things that came after her that she would be appalled by were also things that were happily, comfortably inherited by Cameron, by the Cameron government, the Cameron Osborne government, the coalition government, and then what became a Conservative government. And so you could read it two ways, one of which is that, yes, Margaret Thatcher had her triumphant 1980s, but actually the things that she believed in faded away to the extent that actually, far from Labour adopting her mantle, the Conservative Party ended up adopting the new Labour mantle. The other way to read it is to say the mere fact that the Conservative Party ended up adopting a kind of new Labour mantle. Cameron and Osborne were said to refer to Tony Blair as the master, and we must learn from the master, is the ultimate evidence that the thing that was defeated was socialism. Socialism, as Margaret Thatcher understood it, that creed that runs through the 20th century from, say, the First World War through to her time in office. What came after her was something, so yes, it was welfarist, but the things that you have described, it was welfarist, it was broadly pro-European, though that's where the two parties diverge on matters of sexual identity, on what you might call the politics of cultural identity. The two parties came closer together. But there is no way David Cameron and George Osborne would adopt a political programme that in any plausible 1980s sense could be called socialist. So that I'm still unsure which way to read this thing. Was it that Margaret Thatcher vanquished socialism? And the evidence of that is that the Conservative Party became a party comfortable to take on the new Labour mantle. Or is it that actually Margaret Thatcher lost the fight because ultimately the Conservative Party inherited the mantle of the Labour Party?
I think the loss of socialism as an organising principle in politics is really important. And I think that is actually one reason why the Conservative Party struggles so badly for coherence in the decades that follow. If we think about the Conservative Party across the 20th century, like any big portmanteau party, it's always contained within it all sorts of different political tendencies and strains. So it's got within it free marketeers and national protectionists. It's got one nation conservatives and Thatcherites. It's got people who lean towards the Commonwealth and people who want a new identity in Europe. It's got powerlights who are quite suspicious about an alliance with the United States, that actually have sovereigntist problems with organisations like NATO. So any party of that size is always going to be pulling in lots of different directions. What it has until 1990 is a sort of magnetic charge that pulls all of those iron filings towards it, which is the idea that your fundamental purpose is to resist socialism. And the Cold War frames all of that. It means that you can position British politics within a great global struggle. It means that you can point to the Labour Party and say they are the representatives of a foreign power. You can smear socialism in Britain as a foreign totalitarian ideology. That magnetic charge really falls away in the 1990s. And the result of that is that those iron filings simply scatter again all across the political landscape. And I think what we see in the decades that follow is the Conservative Party constantly looking for a substitute, looking for some new organising enemy. It might be Europe. It might be political correctness. It might be wokeness. And these things are often described in the language of socialism. People talk about cultural Marxism or a sort of Blairo-socialist consensus, by which they tend to mean libertarian social policies rather than economic policy. But none of those things really work. So we have what was once a very directed political tradition that becomes very flaccid and that's constantly tugging itself in different directions.
Looking at those decades, I'm going to identify three events, and you've touched on one of them already, and we've touched on another where we've not used this word yet in our conversation in relation to Europe. But the decades after Thatcher's fall, the Major years, then the Blair-Brown years, the Cameron-Osborne years, it's possible to see them as a playing out of the legacy of Margaret Thatcher in different ways. So there's no single story here. It's not like Margaret Thatcher won, and what came afterwards was just a sort of warmed up or more palatable version of Thatcherism. It's not simply straightforwardly that she set the terms of the argument, but nonetheless, it feels like that's the post-Thatcher era in British politics. She did still, in many ways, serve to define the contours of politics. And then I'm going to list three events that maybe mark the end of the post-Thatcher period: the financial crisis, the Brexit referendum, and COVID. And we now have the politics that we have now. And the politics that we have now feel like it is a consequence of those three things, much more than, Margaret Thatcher feels like she comes from another age. Do you think any of those or all of them together, or would you want to rank them in order of significance? But do you think those three events mark the end of a period where it's still possible to see British politics playing out, even if it's not as Thatcher would have wanted it, in terms that she would recognise, into a new era? Which is the break point, do you think?
I think if we take the first two of those in particular, the Great Financial Crisis and Brexit, what they do is they tap into different versions of Thatcherism. So one problem here is that Margaret Thatcher in the late 90s and early 2000s in some ways ceases to be a historical figure and becomes a mythic figure or even a kind of religious figure. And there are many different Margaret Thatchers out there that you can worship. And we saw this in the 2022 Conservative leadership contest. We saw Rishi Sunak launching his campaign at Margaret Thatcher's birthplace in Grantham, presenting himself as the inheritor perhaps of the early Margaret Thatcher, where it's all about good housekeeping, not spending more than you earn, and bringing debt down. Meanwhile, we saw Liz Truss curating an entire Instagram feed of images of herself in Thatcherite poses, even turning up to one of the leadership debates dressed as Margaret Thatcher, but invoking a different Thatcher, which was the kind of Boadicea Thatcher of the later years, who would swing her handbag at Europe and would never back down and was always forceful.
And look good in a tank.
Exactly. And so there are different versions of Thatcher that people can pick on. So the Great Financial Crisis in some ways reanimates one form of Thatcherism, because the Conservative Party under George Osborne is very successful at turning a crisis of the banks and of global finance into a crisis of state expenditure, and saying this is essentially a kind of sovereign debt crisis. And that what we need to do, therefore, is do what Margaret Thatcher did in the early 1980s, which is to bring down spending and balance the books. So there is a way, absolutely, that you can make sense of the global financial crisis as a Thatcherite. Likewise, with Brexit, you can cherry pick the period in Margaret Thatcher's career when she becomes increasingly hostile to Europe and say this is, in a sense, completing the work of the Bruges speech. This is completing the work of her opposition to the Maastricht Treaty. But those are not the same Margaret Thatcher that's being invoked in either case.
And the Conservative Party that emerged from those events, particularly from Brexit, and then from Boris Johnson's premiership, so after the 2019 general election, the thing that it had lost was the thing that you described just now, the Margaret Thatcher Conservative Party having, which was that broad range of opinion. So the thing that Margaret Thatcher did not do to the Conservative Party is purge it. I mean, she saw off the forces within it that she thought were serving to hold her back, and ultimately she tried to see off the forces that would bring her down, and they got their revenge in the end. She fired people, she promoted people, she made it clear who her favourites were, all of that. She did politics. But she didn't purge it. She didn't say you cannot be a member of the Conservative Party unless you hold these things to be self-evident. The party that emerged after 2019 had been shrunk ideologically, or at least politically. People who would have been considered wets by Margaret Thatcher were thrown out. She didn't throw the wets out of her party. She just defeated them. And in a way, that feels like it's a stage beyond the post-Thatcher period. The Conservative Party of Boris Johnson, or even the Conservative Party of Liz Truss for the 20 minutes that it lasted, these were narrower projects. The thing that you described in the last episode, which is just the range of what she did, the variety of modes in which she operated, the extent of the forces with which she was willing to compromise, as well as the extent of the forces with which she wasn't willing to compromise. It does feel a little like, ironically, as people choose their Margaret Thatcher and then die in that ditch that she has put them in, that's what's been lost. It is actually the breadth of the Thatcher project that has been lost.
Yes, I think her cabinet making is completely different to that of many of her successors. She actively promotes people from different parts of the Conservative Party, people like Ken Clarke, That's partly because she really enjoys arguing. And so if she finds somebody who can stand up to her in argument and who appears to be a competent departmental minister, she's actually generally quite happy to promote them. And that's one reason, of course, why she falls in 1990, is that actually she has a cabinet that isn't ideologically Thatcherite and that isn't wedded to her particular vision of doing politics. And ironically, I think it becomes more important to be a Thatcherite in the Conservative Party after her fall than it was while she was in power. Because, of course, as long as she's there, you know this is a Thatcherite party. Once she's not there, then there's a power struggle that has to be fought, and it becomes more important to impose these kinds of loyalty tests. I suppose the only potential rider I would put on that is that while it's clearly the case that the Conservative Party is a much broader church in the 1980s than it is in 2025, it's not as broad a church as it was 30 years earlier. So Margaret Thatcher's most successful electoral performance in terms of votes cast is 1979, when she wins 44% of the vote. That is actually the lowest total on which any Conservative government had been elected since 1922. And it falls over the rest of the 1980s. Although the majority goes up, she actually only wins 42% in 1983 and 1987. Now, we've talked in other episodes about how politicians play the electoral system in which they find themselves. They don't actively set out to maximise their share of the vote. That would be an absurd thing to do. But nonetheless, it is becoming possible to win elections on a smaller share of the vote in the 1980s than was the case in the 1950s or the 1960s. And that longer social process by which first past the post is starting to bend into new shapes also has an effect on her successors, because it means, for example, that you can win good majorities on much smaller shares of the vote in the 2010s and in the 2020s than you could when she was Prime Minister.
In relation to what you were just saying just now about her willingness to promote people with whom she could have a good argument, John Major came to her attention when he was a junior minister because he attended a dinner at which she was present at the absolute height of her powers, I think in 1987, just at that point where to take her on was a brave act. And she was a formidable person. Some people were in love with her. Quite a lot of people were frightened of her. Some people were in love with her and were frightened of her. And at that dinner, she said something that John Major thought was nonsense. And he probably had one glass of wine too many. And he said, "Prime Minister, that's nonsense." And she was furious and sort of barked at him and snapped at him. And he stood his ground and he told her why he thought it was nonsense. And apparently after that dinner, he came out and someone found him with his head in his hands. "I've blown it. I can't believe my one chance with the Prime Minister. And I've just told her she's a fool." And someone said, no, you haven't blown it. You've made it. You passed the test. It is a side of her personality that I think gets neglected. But on that broader point that the party narrowed during her time in office, the Conservative Party was always, in its own mind at least, the natural national party of government. It was a party of the nation. By that, I don't mean it was a nationalist party, but it spoke for the nation as a whole. It was not factional. It was capable of drawing together different parts of the United Kingdom, the Union, but also different parts of the nation understood in cultural or social terms. And over the course of the 1980s, that ceased to be true. So the producer of this podcast, my wife Helen, grew up in Liverpool in the 1980s. So the last two sets of episodes we've done on Militant last time and today, slightly triggering for her, because to grow up in Liverpool in the 1980s is still to this day to have a visceral loathing of Margaret Thatcher and everything that she stood for. Scotland, a key component of the Union, the natural happy hunting ground of the Conservative Party when it saw itself as the natural national, understood as the United Kingdom, party of government. Scotland was lost to the Conservative Party during the Thatcher years in the same way that Liverpool was lost to the Conservative Party during the Thatcher years. The experience of Thatcherism, not just the economic experience, but almost the psychic experience of Thatcherism, is so different in different parts of the country, to an extent that there isn't really a comparable political figure of whom one could say that. No one, as she was winning her election victories, no one fractured the political psyche of the country in the way that she did. She divided the nation. And that part of her legacy, I think, tends to get downplayed by the people who revere her. It may be overplayed by the people who revile her, in the sense that people in Liverpool may feel that the rest of the country should pay more attention to the extent to which she's the single most evil person. In my wife's household growing up, they had Margaret Thatcher toilet paper. That's, that's a political position, but it's a pretty uncompromising one. You could see the 1980s as the high point of the Conservative Party as the natural national party of government. 3 election victories, thumping majorities, dominating the political landscape, setting the agenda, bringing on board a whole set of different forces and ideas and conflicts and combining them in what looked like a political, if not ideology, then crusade, and winning so many of those fights. These were the glory years of the Conservative Party as the party that was born to govern Britain. And this was also the beginning of the end of the Conservative Party as the party that was born to govern Britain, because by the end of the 1980s, the Conservative Party had left a nation that could be governed in that way in tatters. It had broken it up.
It's probably worth asking what we mean by this term, the natural party of government, because it's one that reverberates around conservative politics for quite a lot of the 20th century. And I think what we tend to mean is not just a party that's in government quite a lot, but a government that is rooted in the institutions of the country and that has a kind of cultural reach and authority that exceeds that of any other party. That it has a kind of outsized capacity to shape what is thought of as the common sense of British politics. And there are all kinds of ways in which that's true of conservatism in the mid-20th century. So it's a party that is anchored in British business, in the monarchy, the armed services, agriculture, the professions, the Church of England. It dominates the print media. It has an overwhelming dominance of the media. It also has a geographical reach, actually, which considerably exceeds Labour for most of the 20th century. Labour has certain heartlands, and at odd elections it breaks out of them. When the Conservative Party is at its most potent, it is winning in Scotland, in Wales, in the south of England, in the northeast, in the northwest, in the Midlands. It has an extraordinary geographical range. That is much less true in Margaret Thatcher's period than it had been in the 1950s, partly because, to some extent, the world in which it had been embedded is starting to disappear. It's less important to be embedded in the monarchy or the armed forces than it had been previously. The role of the print media is still very important, and that's one of the things that sustains Margaret Thatcher. But that kind of voluntarist society of, village fetes, mothers' unions, women's institutes, conservative clubs, young conservatives organisations, that kind of world is falling away. And one of the accidental discoveries of the 1980s is that you can still win elections without a lot of those things. That you can win elections without Scotland. That you can win elections without places that have once been conservative heartlands in many of the industrial cities. That first past the post will continue to give you majorities. That you can win elections with enormous levels of unemployment, so long as they are relatively regionally concentrated. That's a surprise to most politicians in the 1980s, but in some respects it's a dangerous lesson because it means that parties stop thinking about how they can build as broad an electoral coalition as possible, and it leaves them vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable, to quite small drops in support, which can then produce very big swings under first past the post.
Although New Labour, in a way, was trying to buck the lesson of the 1980s. Tony Blair, among many other things, was an extremely cautious politician electorally, and he thought this formidable machine, the Conservative machine, could only be defeated by pulling together what in some ways, as you've just described it, is something like a Conservative-style coalition, in the sense that Tony Blair did try to pull together what had become disparate parts of the country very successfully, though not with a huge vote share. Again, it must be remembered, New Labour didn't come anywhere near to winning 50% of the national vote when it won its thumping majorities. But there was a sense in which New Labour was trying to replicate the ability that the Conservative Party had once had. And Tony Blair wanted the Labour Party to be the natural party of government. He wanted it to be the party of the nation. He wanted it to be the political wing of the British people as a whole. That's what he called it at one point, ironically echoing the language of the IRA. So it's not just a straightforward story that from the 1980s onward, British politics became a contest to see who could exploit a fractured nation most effectively. But that certainly does seem to chime with the politics that we have today, which is a politics in which the Keir Starmer government was not built actually on a very broad or wide coalition. It was a very targeted coalition. And that does seem to be one of the legacies of that period of British politics. First Past the Post began its slow and steady move to what we have today, which is, among other things, the end of the two-party system.
I think New Labour is probably the most substantial and intellectually serious attempt to think about what politics should look like in the post-socialist world that we were talking about earlier. If you've lost socialism as that great organising principle of politics, then what are the parties going to stand for thereafter? And as you say, Tony Blair has this kind of rainbow coalition vision of what the Labour Party should be, that it's still going to be anchored in a traditional working class, but it's also going to reach out to all of the other progressive forces of British politics. And for a period, that is spectacularly successful. But that is becoming more and more difficult to do for all of the reasons that we've discussed in some previous episodes, that in all sorts of ways British society is becoming more fractured and more splintered. And New Labour discovers in 2005 it can still win a very substantial election majority on a historically very small share of the vote. In that sense, I think New Labour perhaps represents the last gasp of an attempt to do big tent politics, and we haven't really seen a project of that kind since.
Should we think of Thatcherism as a distinctively British political form, or should we try and locate it in wider international forces and trends? So it does sometimes get folded into a move that is happening not across the board in Western democratic societies, but much more broadly than in Britain, particularly in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States. And there are other isms that it gets associated with. So one is the move to what gets called, not universally, but generally now neoliberalism, a move more broadly to a post-industrial, market-based, deregulated form of political economy, which happened in the United States and also happened in other places too, though to a lesser extent. That's what comes after, in a way. It's been christened that with hindsight, I think. What came before Thatcherism, and part of its inspiration was actually West German politics, what was called ordoliberalism, which was, again, another version of a strong state and a market economy that was thought to be the inspiration, particularly for Keith Joseph. And if Keith Joseph lies behind the Thatcher story, we haven't talked about him much, but it would have been him. We might just conceivably, though probably not, as you said, be talking about Josephism. I think it's unlikely. But Thatcherism was not a homegrown phenomenon in the sense it looked very much to Europe, particularly during the period where Thatcherism was not associated by any means with Euroscepticism. Is it part of a wider international movement? Should we think of it as that? Is there something too parochial about thinking that what we are talking about here is a distinctively British phenomenon?
I think successful political movements are almost always local manifestations of much broader international phenomena. They're almost always drawing on ideas and changes that are happening in many different parts of the world. But if they're going to succeed, it really is important that they anchor themselves in the specific challenges and dilemmas of a particular political environment. So if we think about Reform UK today, we can clearly draw connections between Reform and the Trump movement in the United States, or Meloni in Italy, or other kinds of radical right parties that are gathering steam across much of Europe and the wider world. And yet, Reform is also in all sorts of ways, an exclusively British party. Nigel Farage plays a very British kind of figure. This is a party that wraps itself in the Union Jack and swims in pints of ale. It's very effective at saying, we are a kind of grassroots rebellion of the people of this country against a treasonous elite. It does that very effectively. And I think we could say something similar about the 1980s. In that, as you say, West Germany is a really powerful influence on the early Thatcher project. When Keith Joseph is setting up the Centre for Policy Studies as the kind of think tank that's going to drive this revolution, he originally wanted to call it the Centre for the Social Market, and that's a term that he's drawn from West Germany. We've talked previously about some of the influences upon it being an Austrian political philosopher, Friedrich von Hayek, or a Chicago economist, Milton Friedman. We've talked about its connections to Ronald Reagan. We could talk about its connections to General Pinochet in Chile. So it's drawing on things that are happening all around the world, and the kind of pressures that it's responding to, like deindustrialization, are to some extent global pressures. But it works because Margaret Thatcher will always say that she is an English nationalist. That's a term that she uses herself, that she's able to present this as a homegrown response to a set of homegrown problems. Because parties aren't just kind of antennae receiving signals from overseas. All those big global forces and ideas are also working on Britain itself. So they're producing some similar fruits in different places.
She called herself an English nationalist, yet she was opposed to devolution, partly presumably because she thought England would lose out. She was a unionist. She was, in a way, a staunch unionist. It does feel like one space in which her political antennae were not particularly well attuned was to recognise the pressures on the union itself and the ways in which that version of conservatism, which comes under the guise of English nationalism, is actually going to accelerate the thing that she says she deeply regrets, which is the fracturing of the union into semi-self-governing political units, Scotland, Wales, going their own way. She got some things wrong, and one of the things that feels like she got wrong, and actually, it is often held up as the exemplification of her blind spot, that she tried out the poll tax on Scotland before it was tried out in England as a kind of what looked to the Scots like a social experiment, what looked to Margaret Thatcher just like a pragmatic move to ease the tax in. It feels like she was somewhat blinkered to the ways in which her version of English nationalism, taking these international forces and giving them a particularly English slant, was going to break up the thing that, in some ways, she said she held most dear, which was the union itself.
I think her antennae did struggle to receive signals from Scotland. I think it was a political culture and a place that she found very difficult to read. And actually, that was a disappointment to some of her supporters. When she became leader in 1975, The Spectator ran a big piece about how popular she would be in Scotland. And she would often say Thatcherism comes from Scotland, that this is the politics and the economics of Adam Smith, that this is a politics that's about, if you like, thrift and traditional Scottish values of that kind. It was also in some ways a kind of anti-Westminster politics early on. It was the idea that the Westminster state has got too big and that this is cramping the freedom of people all over the country. And in her early years, she would say she wasn't anti-devolution as such. What she was anti was additional layers of government in places like Scotland and Wales. She doesn't want more of the state in these places. Instead, what she's going to offer is real devolution, which is the power of ordinary people in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland to keep more of their money, to have more freedom over their economic lives, and not to have their economies directed from London. And actually, in 1979, she does quite well in Scotland. It's only thereafter, really, that the Thatcher project falls off a cliff there. And it's partly that I don't think she has any sensitivity to an older Tory unionism, which recognised that one of the ways in which you hold the union together is that you celebrate its difference. So this is a union that is actually founded on the idea that Scotland keeps its own legal system, that Scotland keeps its own established church, that you can have a Secretary of State for Scotland, you can devolve all sorts of forms of decision-making to Scotland. And in that sense, Margaret Thatcher wasn't a unionist in a traditional Tory sense. She was more a kind of Unitarian who just assumed that every part of the United Kingdom should be governed in the same way. It's perhaps worth saying, I think the point about trying out the poll tax in Scotland is a bit of a myth, in that actually the Scottish Conservative Party had been pressing very hard for this, partly because of some very difficult election results in Scotland. This was something that Scottish Conservatives actually wanted and believed might be popular. But the myth that it's tried out in Scotland becomes very powerful. And just as the Margaret Thatcher myth has a continuing force for decades afterwards, myths about Margaret Thatcher can also have a continuing power.
Nigel Farage, in his own telling of his own life story, will describe himself as a Thatcherite. So he was a very happy Thatcherite. He worked in the City of London. I think his Thatcher was the Thatcher of the Big Bang. We haven't mentioned the Big Bang, but part of the era of deregulation alongside deindustrialization. Hard times in the north, but boom times in the south, particularly boom times in London. Boom and then a kind of bust. But that was Nigel Farage's world as a young man, until, as he said, he was unable to stomach the Conservative Party's betrayal of the United Kingdom in relation to Europe. And I think he probably thinks that Margaret Thatcher herself was betrayed in many ways by her own party. So Nigel Farage thinks of himself as a one-time Thatcherite. Nigel Farage was, until very recently, described as a politician who couldn't possibly have any appeal north of the border. I mean, the idea that Reform UK, which is a party of English nationalism, would do well in Scotland or in Wales. And yet it turns out actually that whatever that project is, the rising up of the ordinary people against treacherous elites, it seems to have quite a lot of legs in Scotland and in Wales. Elections are coming up which will test this further, but for now at least, I can remember just a couple of years ago when if Farage went to Scotland, the question was, would he come out alive? It's not true now. So he's building in some ways a national coalition, national in terms of the United Kingdom. So I want to ask you who, or whether anyone, could be said to bear the Thatcher mantle in British politics today. Let's start with Nigel Farage. Is it plausible in any sense to talk of him now, as he currently stands in British politics, as a Thatcherite, as an heir to Margaret Thatcher?
Well, there are certainly some similarities you could pick out. They both, in different ways, play a kind of everyman character. More obviously in Nigel Farage's case, but Margaret Thatcher very much played the idea that she was the housewife who happened to run the country on the side. They both see themselves as the kind of articulator of the thoughts and beliefs and experiences of an ordinary Britain that has been neglected by the establishment. To some extent, they're both anti-establishment figures, in that, Margaret Thatcher in the 70s in particular would position herself against a kind of trade union elite and a sort of wet Tory elite that had complacently presided over a culture of decline. They're both in different ways explicitly nationalist politicians, and Nigel Farage can claim to be in the tradition of the late Margaret Thatcher on Europe. On the other hand, though, Margaret Thatcher's politics, I think, are always fundamentally about a kind of moral reformation of the people, that she's a deeply morally conservative figure who always insists that the chief problem with socialism isn't actually the economic damage it does. It is the moral decline over which it has presided. She says socialism is evil. So she's not one of those Tories who thinks it's a nice idea that doesn't work. She thinks it's a fundamentally evil idea. And her politics are always, in some sense, about a kind of moral reorientation of the British people. I don't think Nigel Farage has any interest in moral reformation. And I don't mean that just as a sort of rude thing to say about him. I think he would take a view that it's not really any of the government or the state's business what the moral character of the people are. That's an element of Margaret Thatcher's politics that has fallen away. So we're back in that problem that there are all these fantasy versions of Thatcher floating around, and you can pick one of them and align yourselves with them. Whether you're Nigel Farage or Liz Truss or Keir Starmer occasionally tries it. But ultimately, I think all of these are going to be quite flimsy. And the reason for that is that Margaret Thatcher doesn't drop out of a spaceship. She's not sent to Earth as God's messenger. She is the product of a particular historical moment. She's somebody, in all the ways we've discussed, who is shaped in the early to mid-20th century by the culture of provincial Methodism in Grantham, whose politics are then shaped by the experience of the World War and the Cold War, who is struggling with the questions of her time around deindustrialization, perceived national decline, who is a woman in a political system that is overwhelmingly male. And in that respect, all you're going to get if you try to be Thatcher today is a sort of weird cosplay of one part of her that feels strangely out of time. So in the unlikely event that the Conservative Party or even Reform were to phone me up and ask for advice, I would say stop sticking electrodes in the ground and trying to reanimate the corpse of Margaret Thatcher. By all means, think about her time and power, try to learn from it. But if you were able to produce a Margaret Thatcher today, she would by definition not be well suited to the problems and political questions of the day.
And it is sometimes said of Nigel Farage that actually his greatest weak spot is the fact that he might be ideologically a Thatcherite, because his natural support is not ideologically Thatcherite. He is speaking for the left behinds. His movement has its base, insofar as it has a base, in some of the places that were ravaged by Thatcherism, in Nottinghamshire, in the northeast, indeed now possibly in parts of Wales and Scotland. And if what Nigel Farage in his heart of hearts believes in is a kind of late 1980s big bang deregulated small state / welfare, let barrow boys and wide boys make as much money as they can and good luck to them and don't make them pay too much tax, which may be what he believes actually, that's not going to fly. I mean, that's political kryptonite if you want to form a Reform UK government, he has got to fight the culture wars, and he may try and fight them as cosplaying Margaret Thatcher, but it's a stretch. But in terms of basic economic policy, he cannot be the thing I think that he thinks Margaret Thatcher stands for in his own mind. He actually has to hide that if it's true.
Well, one thing that they probably do have in common is that Nigel Farage, like Margaret Thatcher, is a much more supple politician than he appears to be. That he is actually somebody who I think has quite a skilled sense of when he needs to bend and when he needs to make sort of tactical concessions. And in that respect, actually, in some ways, he's been more effective at creating a kind of post-Thatcherite politics of the right than most of her admirers in the Conservative Party. So we've seen him talking about things like abolishing the two-child benefit cap. We've seen him calling for the nationalisation of essential industries, which is a very un-Thatcherite thing to do, because he knows he's now pitching to that support base. There's been quite an interesting theme, I think, in a certain amount of reform messaging recently, which is about rehabilitating the 1970s, talking about what a great time the 1970s was. That this was a period when, you could afford a house and when everybody had a job and apparently there wasn't any crime. And that's something that the Conservative Party can't do, because the Thatcher story is that the 70s is a catastrophe and the 1980s is the moment at which Britain emerges from that. Reform is doing something quite interesting by saying, actually, we're looking to a period that is neither Thatcher nor New Labour, which allows it to present itself as transcending both of those two things in British politics.
I want to finish by going back to where we started in a way, and it might seem like a somewhat trivial question, but I find it really interesting which politicians get to become an ism and which don't. And there is something called Thatcherism, and there hasn't really been an ism since. Blairism maybe, but I think Blairism is something that people find quite hard to define. There's no Brownism, there was no Cameronism, no Johnsonism really, Mayism, Trussism, Sunakism. People talk about Starmerism. I defy anyone to tell you what Starmerism is. The only other ism that has emerged in British politics since Margaret Thatcher is Corbynism. Corbynism is an ism. There's one other politician who gave his name to something which I think people understand what that means, and it has an ideological flavour. And what's so fascinating about that is that the brief Corbyn period, he was a throwback to the 1980s. Jeremy Corbyn is a product of Margaret Thatcher's world. Now, I don't know whether that's to do with her, to do with the 1980s, to do with how he defined himself. He came into politics in the early 1980s. He was there on the front line of those battles that you described. When the miners' strike drew everyone together, it also clearly drew Jeremy Corbyn in. CND, GLC, IRA, NUM, that's Corbyn's world. Those were Thatcher's enemies within. Corbyn represented them. Do you think we should think that the fact it's only Corbynism, there may be other isms to come, Badenockism, I don't know. I don't think there's even a Farageism, not yet. Do you think the fact it's Corbynism should lead us to believe actually it is the ideological struggles of the 1980s that lend themselves to this kind of naming of politics, and that's the era that's gone? And one of the confusing things about British politics is that we had this sort of brief throwback period when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, when in a way he was sticking electrodes into the ground and trying to reanimate the fights of the 70s and of the 80s. And it's that era that's come to an end.
Yes, I don't think it's an accident that so many figures emerge in the 1970s and 80s who believe in ideological struggle. We've talked about this being a period of extraordinary conflict when big historical trends are exploding like volcanoes, and that's throwing up these figures like Margaret Thatcher, Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn, Arthur Scargill, Ian Paisley, and so on. And the politics of the 1990s and 2000s isn't going to do that in the same way. There is a really powerful sense across British politics in the late 1970s that an entire way of doing politics has broken down. And that's an idea that's as strong on the left as it is on the right. So when we talked in a previous episode about the rise of militant in this period, militant is also a response to this sense that a Keynesian consensus has failed and we're looking for something new. Tony Benn is projecting a new kind of Labour. Tony Blair, of course, creates something called New Labour. So it's an extraordinarily fertile project intellectually. And I think one of the puzzles of our current time is that in lots of ways, we might be in a similar moment. It's hard to find many people in British politics who think that the way that we've been doing politics, the way that we've been running the economy for the last however many years, is actually working. So everybody presents themselves as a candidate of change. Keir Starmer talks constantly about a Labour government elected on a platform of radical change. And yet it's quite difficult to see ideologically where that is actually happening in ways that aren't simply throwbacks to that period. And I suspect that that's partly because of the two elements that clip together to make something like Thatcherism or something like Corbynism work. One is the clear association with a particular personality who is around in politics for quite a long time. We now generally have very short political careers. It's difficult for one individual to generate that kind of personal charisma. And the other is a sense that ideas matter, that actually one of the core purposes of politics is that it is a place of intellectual struggle, that ideas are not simply something that happen in university seminars. They are something that politicians wield against one another as weapons. I don't think that's how Keir Starmer thinks about politics at all. It's not totally clear to me that it's how Kemi Badenoch thinks about politics either. So we have this extraordinary intellectual vacuum in British politics, but at some point that will be filled with something. And I suspect if you're recording podcasts in 40 years' time and we're looking back on this period, we might be talking about it as the start of something politically new. We just can't see at the moment what that might be.
And it is partly a question of timing because, as you say, in the 1970s, we're feeling this doesn't work anymore. The system is broken. We need something new. But go back to, say, late 1980, and people would have been saying about the Thatcher government what they're saying about the Starmer government now, which is she's talked about the need for something new, but where is the new? This list looks like more of the same, but worse. It's like more of the same, but actually with worse outcomes, exactly what they're saying about Starmer now. For the reasons you say, I don't think Starmer is going to turn into Margaret Thatcher. It's a different kind of career. It's a different kind of politics. But it is also the case that there aren't these clean breakpoints. The 70s were a basket case. Margaret Thatcher came along in 79 and people could see they were on the path to something new. It's a slow, gradual process. The old is there in the new is there in the old. And if we are living through a similar period, we're not in 1983, 84, 85. If we're somewhere now, we're in 1978, 79, 1980. And in 78, 79, 80, it was not clear what the new world was going to be.
If we're anywhere, we might even be somewhere like 1981. If we were going to look at the polls in, September 1981, then what we would see would be, I think, the Conservative Party on about 29%, Labour on 28%, and a new insurgent force, the SDP Liberal Alliance, on 40%. In December, we would find the Alliance on 50%, which is almost double what Reform is polling now, while Labour and the Conservatives were bumping along at 23%. So actually a moment in which both major parties seem to be failing, in which the government's policies don't seem to be working, but the opposition doesn't look viable, and the electorate is looking somewhere else for a radical policy response. That is something that we've seen before. When we talk about broken Britain today, I think you could make a much stronger case for broken Britain in 1981, when you've got more than 3 million people unemployed, when you've got riots in many of Britain's major cities, when interest rates are hurtling towards 17%, inflation has been around 20%. There's a very powerful sense at that moment that politics has broken, isn't working, and something new has to replace it. We know how that story ends because we're now looking back at it from a distance. We don't know how our own story ends. And in that respect, I think the kind of confident predictions that are constantly being made about what is going to happen at the next general election are very unwise because we're standing in the middle of the kaleidoscope and everything is spinning and moving around us.
And we know that if you went back to December 1981, you were 4 months out from Argentina invading the Falkland Islands. But they didn't know that, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2026.
Yes, and not long before that, we'd had David Steel, the leader of the Liberal Party, telling the Liberal Party conference to go back to your constituencies and prepare for government. A sentence that seems completely absurd today, but actually was at least as rational as Reform saying that today. So politics is never set. It doesn't obey iron laws. Politics is constantly fluid. It is open to asteroids from space, and we don't know what might be heading in our direction.
It is December tomorrow, and we don't often encourage you to buy stuff, but we are going to do it today. We have gifts. And if you're looking for a present for someone you think would like this podcast or you know does like this podcast, you can give them a gift subscription to PPF Plus. If you go to our website and go to the PPF Plus page, or if you click on the link in the show description, you will see you can give 6-month or 12-month gift subscriptions to PPF Plus. It will go to the recipient of your choice, and you can set it to be delivered on Christmas Day. The recipient will get access to our entire bonus episodes archive, all of our bonus episodes going forward, ad-free listening, and sign up to our fortnightly newsletter. If you are looking for a present for someone in your life who is interested in philosophy or politics, history, in ideas, do consider a gift subscription to PPF Plus, and you will also be supporting this podcast. We have merch as well. We very rarely mention it, but it's there. You can get it on our website. You can click on the link in our show description. We have tote bags. We have bone china mugs. Those gifts are available too. Next time, I'm going to be speaking to the person who was the first ever guest on Past, Present, Future, the novelist Ian McEwan. We're delighted to have him back, and this is going to be a conversation about how to imagine the apocalypse and what it is to think about the present as a future past. That is, how are historians going to remember us? With the novelist Ian McEwan next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.